It turns out ChatGPT might actually be making us dumber, and I am coping hard. A new research paper out of MIT shows not only does using ChatGPT make you forget what you just wrote, but you also don't feel like you actually wrote it yourself. And the damage lasts after you stop using the large language model to help you write essays. This has enormous implications on not only learning, but how humans are going to think in the future. And there are a ton of other insights in this 200+ page research paper. I'm gonna break it all down for you right now. This is the paper, Your Brain on ChatGPT. It sounds like your brain on drugs. Accumulation of cognitive debt when using an AI assistant for essay writing task, out of MIT. This study focuses on finding out the cognitive cost of using an LLM in the educational context of writing an essay. And the researchers wanted to answer 4 questions. 1, do people write significantly different essays when using LLM's search engine and their brain only? So they split the participants into those 3 groups. Those who used their brain only to write the essay, those who used a traditional search engine like Google Search, and those who used large language models. Number 2, how do participants' brain's activity differ when using LLMs? Search or their brain only. Number 2, how do those participants' brain activity differ between those 3 different groups? Number 3, how does using an LLM impact the participants' memory? Turns out pretty substantially. And 4, does LLM usage impact ownership of the essays? That is, perceived ownership of the essay. Does somebody feel like they actually wrote the essay? And it seems like it would be an obvious answer, but stick around, let's find out. Now, I have been a big proponent of using large language models for learning. I use it every day to learn about things. But now after reading this paper, I'm gonna be much more thoughtful about how I'm using LLMs to learn the different topics that I wanna learn about. Listen to this. One of the most unique features of LLMs is their ability to provide contextualized, personalized information. Yes, that is amazing. LLMs generate cohesive, detailed responses to user queries. LLMs also are useful for adaptive learning. They can tailor their responses based on user feedback and preferences, offering iterative clarification and deeper exploration of topics. All of this sounds good, doesn't it? Well, it's not all good. However, it is important to note that the connection between the information LLMs generate and the original sources is often lost, leading to the possible dissemination of inaccurate information. Basically, if you're asking the LLM for a piece of information and you don't check the source, then you don't necessarily know if it's true. And always check the source when you're using a large language model because hallucinations happen. But a lot of the times, these LLMs don't even provide sources. Now, providing citations is a more recent feature of large language models, and I really appreciate it. All of the cutting edge models do provide citation: Perplexity, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, all of them. However, again, listen to this. LLMs have introduced the ability to provide direct citations. However, the issue of hallucinated references, fabricated or incorrect citations remains a challenge. Even when an AI generates a response with a cited source, there is no guarantee that the reference aligns with the provided information. So even if the model says something, references the source, it might not actually reference it properly, and it might not understand what the source was meaning by it. Now, here is the big reveal. The convenience of instant answers that LLMs provide can encourage passive consumption of information. That sounds right, which may lead to superficial engagement, weakened critical thinking skills, less deep understanding of the materials, and less long-term memory formation. But of course, it's not as simple as that. It turns out your intelligence actually affects how you think about using these large language models, and I'll get to that in a few moments. The reduced level of cognitive engagement could also contribute to a decrease in decision-making skills and foster habits of procrastination and laziness in both students and educators. Not only that, the use of LLMs can lead to fewer opportunities for direct human-to-human interaction or social learning, which is incredibly critical, which plays a pivotal role in learning and memory formation. So that is collaborative learning, discussing with your peers, discussing with your teacher. Those discussions and kind of hashing out these ideas and finding the edges or the misunderstandings, that is what makes true learning. All right, before we get into all the results results, I want to give you more information. So the first thing this paper talks about is web search and learning. So that is traditional Google searches, not large language models. 81% of Americans rely on information from the internet a lot when making important decisions. And yeah, I don't really know how I feel about that. Definitely scares me, but at the same time, the internet is a wealth of information. And again, I think it just reflects on your core intelligence. If you're smart, you're going to seek out information on the internet. You're going to validate it. You're going to verify it. You're going to check the citations. But if you're lower IQ, you might not do any of that. And you might just trust the source of whatever is telling you. And guess what? Anyone can write anything online. And they say it here, successful web searching demands domain knowledge, self-regulation, and strategic search behaviors to optimize learning outcomes. So the better you are at using search tools, the better outcomes you're going to get from them, obviously. But also, individuals with high domain knowledge excel in web searches because they are better equipped to discern relevant information and navigate complex topics. So if you're already good at that subject and you're using web search, you're going to also get better results. Now let's talk about cognitive load during web searches. If you're not familiar with cognitive load, it basically means the mental effort imposed by the presentation of information. And they talk about the cognitive load of doing web searches and browsing the internet in general. When information is provided clearly, when information isn't cluttered or there's a lot of ads, there's a lot of navigation or UI elements that take away from the core information, your cognitive load increases. And that just makes a lot of sense. When information is more easily processed and understood, your brain isn't working as hard. But then they talk about cognitive load during LLM usage. Before I tell you, what do you think? Do you think the cognitive load is going to be higher or lower? All right, let's take a look. LLMs have been shown to reduce cognitive load across all types, facilitating easier comprehension and information retrieval compared to traditional methods like web searches. LLM users experienced a 32% lower cognitive load compared to software-only users, with significantly reduced frustration and effort when finding information. That sounds really good, doesn't it? But of course, there are downsides, hence the whole topic of this paper. But the benefit of LLMs is they streamline the information presentation and synthesis process, thus reducing the need for active integration of information and, in turn, a decrease in the cognitive effort required to construct mental schemas. But if you're not thinking as hard, if you're not developing these mental schemas, then maybe you're not truly understanding the information to begin with. And that's an important concept throughout the entire paper. But of course, large language model usage, because there is much lower cognitive load, actually results in much higher productivity, overall output. LLM users are 60% more productive overall, and due to the decrease in extraneous cognitive load, users are more willing to engage with the task for longer periods, extending the amount of time used to complete tasks. But here's the gotcha. While lower cognitive loads often improve productivity by simplifying task completion, LLM users generally engage less deeply with the material, compromising the germane cognitive load necessary for building and automating robust schemas. Students specifically, relying on LLMs for scientific inquiries produced lower quality reasoning than those using traditional search engines, as the latter required more active cognitive processing to integrate diverse sources of information. So what I've gathered from this paper is that when you overly rely on large language models and don't use your brain to think, then of course you're not going to memorize the information as well. You're not going to understand the information as well. You're not going to be able to make connections between disparate parts of the information as well. So this is, again, a strong argument, at least for me, to be very thoughtful about how you're using LLMs to learn different topics. And listen to this. This is really an argument for the future of how humans and AI are going to work together. The reduction of cognitive load leads to a shift from active critical reasoning to passive oversight. That means rather than you doing the mental work of understanding whatever the topic is, you are overseeing AI to do that work for you. There is going to be this fine balance between the skill set of overseeing and orchestrating AI agents and actually deeply understanding the core information itself. And remember how I talked about low IQ and high IQ? Well, listen to this. Higher competence learners strategically used LLMs as a tool for active learning. The lower competence group often relied on the immediacy of LLM responses instead of going through the iterative process involved in traditional learning methods. So this is the same thing. Are you using the LLM as a tool or to do the work for you? And that is a critical distinction that everybody is going to need to think through for themselves. Let's look a little bit deeper into LLMs versus search engines. So on one hand, search engines might be more adapted for tasks that require broad exploration across multiple sources or fact-checking from direct references. Web search allows users to access a wide variety of resources, making them ideal for tasks where comprehensive, source-specific data is needed. In contrast, LLMs are optimal for tasks requiring contextualized, synthesized responses. If you want to get direct to the point, direct to the answer, LLMs are better. They are good at generating concise explanations, brainstorming, and iterative learning. LLMs streamline the information retrieval process by eliminating the need to sift through multiple sources, reducing cognitive load, as we talked about, and enhancing efficiency, which we also talked about with increased productivity. All right, so this entire paper is really about the experiment that they implemented, which is getting 3 groups of students to engage in essay writing. Remember, one group used their brain only, no tools. Another group used search engines only. And then a third group used LLMs only. Then they had this fourth phase. They took the group that used LLMs and had them use just their brain. And then they had the group that used just their brain and had them use LLMs. And to see if that detriment to memory and to understanding of the concepts of whatever topic they're talking about persisted even after they stopped using the LLM, and the results are fascinating. I'll talk about that in a moment. Generative AI can generate content on demand, offering students quick drafts based on minimal input. However, when students rely on AI to produce lengthy or complex essays, they may bypass the process of synthesizing information from memory, which can hinder their understanding and retention of the material. So even though ChatGPT significantly improved short-term task performance, so the output quality, it did not lead to significant differences in knowledge gain or transfer. So the output was much better, but they didn't really learn much more. Here they talk about echo chambers in search and LLM. I'm not going to go too deep into this section, but what they do say is just like search, LLMs with their conversational nature exacerbate the echo chamber problem. And if you're not familiar with the echo chamber problem, it's basically what happens on social media. When you start talking about a subject, when you like something, when you hate something, whatever that subject is, the algorithm starts to give you more of it. And then all of a sudden you realize, oh, I'm only ever seeing a handful of things that I talk about. And all of a sudden you're in this echo chamber of hearing the same ideas, the same opinions over and over again. Think about your YouTube algorithm. You probably have a handful of different topics that appear in your YouTube feed. I know I do. That's because that's what you've searched for. That's what you have interacted with, but that's your echo chamber at the same time. Now, every once in a while, YouTube will feed you this little button that says, do you want to see some new stuff? I always click that because I want to see, what am I missing? And it's so funny how often I use YouTube and I see the same videos over and over again. And I know there are literally billions of hours of videos on YouTube, and I'm only seeing a small fraction of them, yet I'm seeing the same ones over and over again. That's the echo chamber. All right, let's talk about the experiment now. Now, one critique of this paper is it is very light on participants. They originally had 60 adults and 55 completed it. That is not a big number. So although a lot of this paper is fascinating, it's just a seed of information. So as I said, they had an LLM group, which is group 1. This is restricted to using OpenAI's GPT-4o as their sole source of information. Search engine group, group 2, they can use any website to help with their essay writing, but ChatGPT or any other LLM was explicitly prohibited. And then brain-only group. They were forbidden from using search, any website, and any LLM. So here's the protocol. The important stages of the protocol are the essay writing task and the post-assessment interview. So they wrote the essay, then they were asked a bunch of questions about the essay that they wrote. Here are some of those questions that they were asked. Why did you choose your essay topic? Did you follow any structure to write your essay? How did you go about writing the essay? For the LLM group, did you start alone or ask ChatGPT first? For the search engine group, did you visit any specific websites? Now, here's an important one. Can you quote any sentence from your essay without looking at it? Which group do you think failed that question? Then for session 4, remember, each of the groups kind of switch places. LLMs use brain only used LLMs. They were asked, do you remember this essay topic? If yes, do you remember what you wrote in the previous essay? If you remember your previous essay, how did you structure this essay? Which essay do you find easier to write? Which of the 2 essays do you prefer? And this paper is incredibly in-depth. They go over so much about the science of how they measured the results, how they conducted the experiment. It is way too much for me to go over right now, so I'm going to skip over these details. All right, I want to ask you a question. When you read an essay or you read an article, can you tell that it's AI written? A lot of times, I definitely can. Even when somebody sends me an email, I can kind of tell when it's AI written, and there's actually some pretty big implications with that little nuance of being able to tell whether something is AI written or not. Let me read what happened when teachers graded and looked at those essays. So this is direct quotes from 2 English teachers. Some essays across all topics stood out because of a close to perfect use of language and structure, while simultaneously failing to give personal insights or clear statements. So even though it was structured perfectly, grammatically perfect, spelling, everything, there were no real clear statements about what the content actually was. And the teachers called it soulless. And I actually think this is really fascinating. I find the same thing oftentimes with AI video, AI music, AI images. A lot of them are just soulless. And I don't know exactly how to describe it. It just is a feeling. And maybe that feeling is actually what's going to be important for humans to be distinct and unique and special in the future. When there is so much noise to signal, when AI can create basically anything, any video game you want, any movie, any TV show that you want. And I've said this a million times, taste is all that's going to matter. The human element to it. And that's why I have a very optimistic view of the future with AI plus humans. That's why I don't think Hollywood should be so scared. These are tools, not replacements for people. While the essays sounded academic and often developed a topic more in depth than others, we valued individuality and creativity over objective perfection. Again, I'm going to expand on this a little bit more. It's kind of what you see with AI chess. When I see 2 AIs playing each other in chess, it's interesting, but it's not quite as interesting as seeing 2 humans battle each other, using every edge of their intellect to win at this incredible game. And the mistakes in those games are really what sets it apart. Seeing AI perform perfectly against another AI performing perfectly, and one AI ends up performing just slightly worse, is just not as interesting as seeing 2 humans go at it. Now, remember I mentioned ownership, the feeling that I actually wrote this essay. Well, of course, if you're using an LLM to write your essay for you, a lot of people actually don't think that they owned the essay. Now, for search engine and brain only, they basically had 100% feeling of ownership. Now, if that sounds intuitive to you, it did to me as well. But it was more nuanced than that. LLM group either indicated full ownership of the essay for half of the participants, or no ownership at all, or partial ownership of 90% for 1 out of 18, 50-50 for 1 out of 18, and 70-30 for 1 out of 18. But again, search engine and brain only, no reports of absence of ownership at all. All right. So what does all this mean? Let's get into the actual results. The brain-only group had to heavily engage their own cognitive resources. In contrast, the LLM-assisted writing group elicited a generally lower connectivity profile, meaning they were using the brain less. While the LLM group certainly engaged brain networks to write, the presence of a LLM appears to have attenuated the intensity and scope of neural communication. And working memory and executive demands were lighter, presumably because the bot provided external cognitive support. And that is a theme of this paper. You are offloading your cognitive workload. And they actually went a little bit deeper than that. They discovered the information flow is different whether you're using an LLM or not. If you're not using an LLM, you're discovering information and it's bottom up. You're finding all of these things, you're putting together connections, and then all of a sudden you see the high level picture of it all. But it's the opposite for LLM use. For LLMs, it was top down directed. Basically, you took the idea that the LLM gave and then you essentially kind of figured out the little pieces from that primary idea. So brain-only groups showed evidence of greater bottom-up flows, and it can be interpreted as the brain's semantic and sensory regions feeding novel ideas and linguistic content into the frontal executive system. In contrast, the LLM group, with external input from the bot, likely experienced more top-down directed connectivity. Their brain's role was that of integrating and filtering the tool's contributions, then imposing it onto their overall narrative. Very interesting. But maybe AI isn't actually making us dumb. It's just shifting what kind of work our brain does. So while the quantity of executive involvement was less for LLM users, the nature of executive tasks may have shifted from generating content to supervising the AI-generated content. Again, this is a theme of this paper. Are you doing the work or are you supervising agents that are doing the work? And when you use LLMs, it might free up mental resources and make the task feel easier, yet the brain of the user of the LLM might not go as deeply into the rich associative processes that unassisted creative writing entails. So these are all the trade-offs that you have to think about when using an LLM for whatever task you're using it for. Then for the brain-only group, they demonstrated a more extensive and stronger connectivity network during the essay writing task than the search engine group. And those without internet assistance, participants engaged memory and planning networks intensely, aligning with the need to recall information and creatively generate content. So if you have no tools, your brain is working hard. And that actually makes you more creative and more thoughtful of the topic at hand. Of course, when you had the ability to search, the participants likely offloaded some cognitive demands. Instead of remembering facts, they could find them. Instead of internally cross-referencing knowledge, they can verify those via web sources. Now, that doesn't sound like a bad thing to me, but of course, you can't just rely on the web. You can't just rely on LLMs blindly. That is the key concept here. And also the group that used the LLMs were less creative. We found that the brain-only group exhibited strong variability in how participants approached essay writing across most topics. So when they were just left with their own brain to work, they were very creative and very differentiated amongst that group. However, the LLM group produced statistically homogeneous essays within each topic. So when you're relying on LLMs, everybody else who's relying on them as well kind of writes the same thing. The search engine group was likely, at least in part, influenced by the content that was promoted and optimized by a search engine. That is the echo chamber as well. So again, these are so many cool dynamics to think about. All right, let me throw a few stats at you. For the search engine group, approximately 34 to 48% lower total connectivity across the brain. The LLM group showed the least extensive connectivity, 55% reduced basically brain usage. And how about memory? Well, the most consistent and significant behavioral divergence between groups was observed in the ability to quote one's own essay. And remember I asked you that question earlier? Here's the answer. LLM users significantly underperformed in this domain. 83% of participants reporting difficulty quoting in session 1. Basically, they used LLMs to write an essay and they couldn't even remember anything from the essay. But that kind of makes sense. And none providing correct quotes. Not a single one of them was able to, even if they remembered the quote, provide it accurately. And search engine and brain-only participants did not have such impairments. They actually achieved a near perfect quoting ability, and by the third session, 100% of both groups' participants reported the ability to quote their essays, with only minor deviations in quoting accuracy. All right, now here is the really scary part. Remember that fourth session I mentioned? Basically, they took the LLM group and had them work with just their brain. They took the brain-only group and had them work with an LLM. Well, it turns out the effects were lasting when you started with LLMs. These LLM to brain participants, the ones who started with LLMs and then shifted to brain only, consistently underperformed relative to session 2 of brain only group. That means if you started with an LLM and then you were asked to write the essay with your brain only, you still underperformed in terms of memory and comprehension. That is quite scary. But again, remember, take it all with a grain of salt because it is a very small pool of participants. So here are some takeaways. Early AI reliance may result in shallow encoding. The LLM group's poor recall and incorrect quoting is a possible indicator that their earlier essays were not internally integrated, likely due to outsourced cognitive processing to the LLM. Basically, you're having the LLM do the work for you. It's not ending up in your brain. Next, withholding LLM tools during early stages might support memory formation, and metacognitive engagement is higher in the brain to LLM group. So the brain-only group might have mentally compared their past unaided efforts with tool-generated suggestions, engaging in self-reflection and elaborative rehearsal, a process linked to executive control and semantic integration, as seen in their EEG profile. So those who started with their brain and then used LLMs to help were better off. So I know that was a lot to digest, but hopefully this all makes sense. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.